Let's go ahead and move on to our final speaker. Dr. Daly is a professor of biological oceanography in the College of Marine Science at the University of South Florida. She has investigated the impacts of the Deepwater Horizon oil spill on the lower trophic food web, including marine snow, phytoplankton, and zooplankton, since 2010. She's an author or co-author on 11 papers that have been related to oil spill and several more that are in preparation or under review. Fun fact about Dr. Daly is that she has participated in more than 20 expeditions to the Antarctic and has rafted down the Colorado River through the Grand Canyon. Without further ado, Dr. Daly, if you could please share your screen and your video, and we will get you started.
Monica, thank you for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation to talk to everybody today. I'm excited to be here. So briefly, I'm going to talk about some ecosystem impacts that help create the MOSSFA event. And Tony, you've already heard from Antonetta and Kai about some of those factors, but I'm going to talk a little bit more. I'll talk briefly about marine oil snow transport, and hopefully if I have time, about potentially some models that might be available for future oil spill response. And you can see here during our May cruise, some of those marine oil snow aggregates that people have talked about, and I used a camera system that I'll show you in a minute. And so I'll be showing you different types of those marine snow images. So this is the camera system that we use. It's called a SIPR, was on a towed platform. And along with the camera, we had CTDs, so we measured temperature and salinity, as well as chlorophyll fluorescence. We had a transmissometer, so we had a variety of environmental parameters that we were measuring at the same time. We collected over 117 million marine snow images on 13 cruises. And here you can see some more of those marine snow images and the big mucus flocks that were we again saw during our cruise in May. Some of the data that I'll be showing you today are from this region right in the oil spill during May 2010. And here you can see the Deepwater Horizon site. And then I have some data following on the oil spill during August 2010 up to August 2014 that were on a series of stations below Mobile Bay. So they went across the shelf slope into deep water. The deepest station's about 2,300 meters. And then across the Florida shelf in the region of the DeSoto Canyon. So you already saw this figure in Antonetta's talk, but again, to go reiterate that there were a lot of complex processes that went into forming marine snow. So many different processes were important, but some were more important. And so I'm going to talk more about the marine biota and the effects they had on the formation, as well as the effect of riverine processes. And to help convince you that this was a major process, this figure shows the extension of the sedimentation event. This is a figure from Isabel Romero's paper in 2017, where she analyzed 2,613 sediment cores over this region and measured the oil in the hydrocarbons in the surface layer and then subtracted out the background concentrations that could be due to natural seeps. And during that, during the oil spill, there were 4 times as high sedimentation rates in 2010 compared to earlier or even later years. So it was a significant event. And you can see how widespread the region was where they detected Deepwater Horizon oil. And I'll come back to this when I talk about transport. So I'm going to jump to the conclusions to start with, and to say that the Deepwater Horizon event was a major event. And as Antonetta said, these marine snow sedimentation events did occur during some earlier oil spills, but they just simply weren't recognized. There's some publications referring to them, but they didn't gain a lot of attention or traction. We think there was a major event during the Ixtoc oil spill in 1979 to 1980 in the southern Gulf of Mexico, and I was on the emergency response team that went down there during that time. But again, it just, people weren't looking for it, and so it didn't receive the attention it should have. But it certainly did during the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. And there's some reasons. Kai talked about some reasons. The low attenuation of the sinking marine snow is certainly a factor. But some of the other factors, the environmental factors, are simply that the Deepwater Horizon site was located in the most productive region in the Gulf of Mexico. And that's because of the Mississippi River outflow. And not only that, but the spill occurred during spring and summer when bacteria and phytoplankton concentrations were at a maximum. Zooplankton activity was really high. So all of the biota that contribute to marine snow were very active. Also, because of the oil spill, the diversionary channels in the Mississippi River were kept open. It was believed that if that additional freshwater outflow could help keep the oil away from sensitive nursery areas along the coastline. But what it did was to cover the entire region with low salinity water and to stratify the surface water column, which enhanced phytoplankton growth because the Mississippi River carries high concentrations of nutrients as well as suspended particulate concentrations. And then as the previous speakers have talked about, enhanced microbial mucus formation. That was also very important. So I'm just briefly going to talk about some of the environmental factors. This figure shows the monthly Mississippi River discharge rate between 2010 and 2014. And the dotted or the dash gray line is the mean flow for 20 years. So there's lots of variability. There's seasonal variability, there's interannual variability. In general, the Mississippi discharge rates are higher in spring and lowest during fall, as you can see over here. The black line is for 2010. There was high river flow in 2010 that actually led to an early phytoplankton bloom in this region. And then once they opened the diversionary channels, there was high flow that was extended through summer into fall, which was unusual. You can see this large peak in spring of 2011. Many of you will remember there was a lot of flooding along the Mississippi River. The National Guard had to come out, rescue people, entire towns were flooded. It was a really bad situation. But it didn't last that long. 2012 was a lower than normal year, and 2013 was another high river flow year. So there's a lot of variability, but 2010 was a very long, sustained river discharge. And once that water comes out of the Mississippi River, and here's the mouth of the Mississippi River, frequently winds push that plume to the west where there's the famous dead zone. There's hypoxic events from that nutrient-fueled water fuels phytoplankton growth, which then causes remineralization and draws the oxygen out of the water. But frequently during summer, the winds shift and push that plume to the east. And that's what happened during 2010. There's a lot of spatial variability. You can see there's different salinity concentrations all through this area, but still that's a lot of nutrients flooding into the area and stratifying that water column, which keeps phytoplankton and zooplankton up near the surface. And in fact, that's what happened. It concentrated phytoplankton and zooplankton near the surface where the oil was. And it led to a phytoplankton bloom. This is a satellite image showing the extent of oil. And this figure shows the phytoplankton fluorescence anomaly. It's a satellite image as well. And generally, phytoplankton concentrations are very high all along coastal regions and near the mouth of the Mississippi River. And it was this year as well. This image shows the anomaly. So it's the region that had much higher chlorophyll concentrations compared to the previous 8 years, including years that had, or other years of high river flow. And so Chua-Min Hu and his group, I was a co-author on the paper, went through all of the different arguments for what might have caused this anomaly. And ultimately, while river flow certainly contributed to it, it didn't seem to explain all of the factors that contributed to this anomaly. And so the assumption was there might have been some role that the oil spill played in this much higher chlorophyll phytoplankton bloom. And indeed, in some other oil spills, people have reported phytoplankton blooms after oil spills. Not all, but some. The mechanisms is still not known. It's not well understood. Some more work needs to be done there. But there were higher phytoplankton concentrations than other years. I wanted to show you some more images of marine snow. People have often asked me, can we tell what the composition is of the marine snow? And as you can see, some of these smaller marine snow aggregates, you really can't see much detail. But the larger ones, we can certainly tell that there's a variety of phytoplankton cells that have stuck to these aggregates. Guinardia is easy to see. There's chain diatoms that are probably sticking out here. Trichodesmium is a blue-green algae that's very prevalent in the area, particularly during summer, that may contribute to some of these aggregates. And as these aggregates move in the water through turbulence, they hit oil droplets, which are very sticky. The aggregates are very sticky. And so the oil gets absorbed into these little spaces and cling onto them. So zooplankton. We know from laboratory experiments that the Deepwater Horizon oil and the dispersant Corexit can have lethal and sublethal impacts on zooplankton. These plots show the vertical distribution of zooplankton during May 2010 at 3 stations that were near the Deepwater Horizon site. The community was very diverse. Much of it was composed of copepods. Keating gnats are a carnivore. They're called an arrowworm. They're probably 10 to 15% of the population. This little tadpole guy is called a larvacean. They turned out to be extremely abundant in the area, which I hadn't appreciated prior to this investigation. And there's also a variety of pelagic shrimps, decapods, and fish. It's a very diverse community. And as you can see, during spring, there were approximately slightly less than 40% of the population was in the upper 20 meters, where the Deepwater Horizon trustees report said were the highest oil concentrations. So the level of oil that is lethal to zooplankton was most frequently encountered in the upper 20 meters. So we didn't follow zooplankton. We don't really know what their exposure rates were. And there's no doubt that there had some lethal impacts. So any zooplankton that died would have contributed to the marine snow. But still, there was a refuge in deeper waters. So 60% of the population could have avoided the worst oil by just being deeper in the water column. And then also marine, different zooplankton actually ingest oil. Doliolids, which you can see this barrel-shaped animal, copepods, and small dinoflagellates called Nautilus are the little globular guys sitting on this marine snow aggregate. They are known to ingest oil droplets and then egest oil in fecal pellets, which would contribute to the marine oil snow, as well as bioaccumulation moving up through the food web. And here you can see big fecal pellets that they produce with oil in them. So all of the phytoplankton and zooplankton and the microbial activity contributed to a much higher marine snow abundance than is normally seen in this area. This is just a size distribution for marine snow aggregates between August 2010 and August 2014, all at this station that's about 50 kilometers from the Deepwater Horizon site. And you can see in 2010, the abundance was much higher. This is a log scale, so that's a very significant difference. But there were also higher concentrations of larger size particles, which would sink very rapidly to the seafloor. Okay, so again, just to reiterate, all of this took place in a very productive region, largely due to the Mississippi River. The spill occurred during summer. There was extended Mississippi River discharge and enhanced microbial mucus formation. So there really was kind of a perfect storm of events that contributed to this massive MOSSFA event. Okay, so briefly to talk about what is the role of marine snow in oil transport. Anna Voss and Claire Paris have a model that they use, a HICOM ocean circulation model that they developed an oil multifraction module for. And we used my field measurements of marine snow to set the initial conditions and run simulations to investigate particle trajectories and residence time. And the model very successfully simulated ocean circulation features. And I just wanted to point out a few features here. This is the loop current with the high velocity circulation fields down to the south. And it was far enough south that it didn't impact the water spill region very effectively. But what you do see here is this anticyclonic eddy. And these eddies are very common. They can form and last weeks to months. They can go away and then new ones come in. So they often kind of sit at the shelf slope area impinging on the DeSoto Canyon. And the action of the edges of an anticyclonic eddy act to upwell nutrient, higher nutrient water, so that can actually also contribute to enhanced phytoplankton productivity at the outside edges of these eddies. They can also act to aggregate marine snow, phytoplankton, and zooplankton, so that could have contributed as well to the higher concentrations that we saw. So we added in, with our marine snow particle concentrations, we also added in sinking rates. We had 3 cases where we had aggregates that were mutually buoyant, so they didn't sink. Aggregates that had low sinking rates of 30 meters per day, and aggregates that had high sinking rates of 200 meters per day. And these rates weren't rates that we just made up. They were actually rates that were measured in the field by Uta Pessow, and Kai was involved in that study. And then a master's student, Clayton Dyke, also measured some rates in the field a few years after the oil spill. And so we chose rates that kind of bracketed the rates that they measured. And what we found was that for high particle sinking rates, that they could actually reach the seafloor within about 5 days on the shelf. So at 25 to 50 meters depth, they could very rapidly sink to the seafloor. At the deeper stations at more than 2,000 meters, it took about 15 days to reach the seafloor. Now remember, there's also currents floating. They're not just sinking directly down, they're also currents are pushing them sideways. So at the deep station, the aggregates with the high sinking rates generally made it down in 15 days and settled within 30 kilometers of the original site. But with low sinking rates, they could be evected up to 80 kilometers away. And the buoyant particles could be transported over 200 kilometers away. So there really is the opportunity for much broader transport within the region. And there was a lot of interannual variability. During September 2011, when there was a large eddy associated with the loop current to the south, that actually dragged water off the shelf and led to even longer transport. So there's a lot of complexity of this. Certainly, there could be significant transport over the region related to these sinking aggregates. One last slide. There was a question about, now that we're aware of the marine snow event and its effect on oil spills, how can our understanding of this process be used in future oil spill decision making? And of course, the short answer to that is it's up to the emergency responders. They have models that they've developed and processes that they follow. But a group of us did work together to start modeling these processes from the Deepwater horizon. And our project was led by Adrian Bird at the University of Georgia. And he used a coagulation model, which he had used for marine snow for many years. This is a well-known model. Coagulation is just the process of two aggregates or particles hitting each other due to turbulence and becoming a larger aggregate and eventually getting large enough that they are denser than seawater and sinking. So we used My Marine Snow field measurements to validate the observations, and the models seem to be validating quite well. And then our next step, we hope to create a generic framework that could be used to move to different locations and use parameterizations to local regions as part of an emergency response tool. We had been talking with Chris Barker at NOAA, who helps develop or leads the development of the GNOME emergency response models, but we were unable to secure funding. So there is a base amount of information available that could be used for future decision-making processes, but there's some work that needs to be done to get to that point. And that, I think, is all I had. My acknowledgements for financial support for all of our activities, and of course, the people that help collect all of our SIPR images and analyze the data. And with that, I thank you.